In the year 775, the most feared man in Byzantium lay dying. His body was rotting while he still breathed. His chamber stank of decay. And, if his enemies are to be believed, worms were eating his eyes. For over 3 decades, Emperor Constantine V had waged war, not against foreign armies, but against God himself. He burned monasteries. He humiliated holy men. He outlawed the sacred images his people had prayed to for centuries. He believed he was purifying the faith. His enemies believed he was damning his soul. And when his final illness struck, many said it was not sickness, it was judgment. This is a story of the emperor they call the Dung-Named, a ruler who rose to unstoppable power, and whose death would become one of the most grotesque morality tales in all of history. The Byzantine Empire in the early 8th century stood as Christianity's eastern bulwark against the rising tide of Islam. It was a realm of gold-domed churches, sacred relics, and holy images, icons of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, painted with such care that the faithful believed they were windows to heaven itself. Soldiers marched into battle carrying them. Mothers prayed before them for their children's safety, and the sick took comfort in their painted faces. But to Emperor Leo III, these icons were not holy. They were dangerous. He believed they were idols, pagan contamination wrapped in Christian paint, and he set about destroying them. It was an act that would ignite one of the most bitter religious wars in Byzantine history. In 718, into this world of holy beauty and violent heresy, a boy was born, Constantine, son of Leo III. From the moment he could walk, he was groomed not only for the throne, but for a religious war. His earliest memories were of soldiers smashing mosaics, burning holy paintings in public bonfires, and monks being mocked or beaten for defending them. As a boy, Constantine saw the icons fall. As a man, he would make sure they never rose again. The young prince grew into a soldier. He fought Arab raiders and Bulgarian invaders with ruthless efficiency, winning victories that seemed to prove his father's belief that destroying icons had restored God's favor to Byzantium. Every battlefield triumph hardened his conviction that faith and force were inseparable. But Constantine was no mere religious zealot. He was a calculating politician who understood that monasteries, the greatest offenders of icons, were also the empire's richest landowners. By smashing icons, he could also smash a rival power base. When Leo III died in 741, Constantine ascended to the throne at just 23 years old. He would not inherit peace. Almost immediately, his brother-in-law, Artabasdos, seized a moment, launching a coup in the name of restoring icons. Civil war followed, brutal and fast. Constantine's armies crushed a rebellion, and when Artabasdos and his sons were captured, their punishment was designed to burn into the memory of all who saw it. Public blinding in the Hippodrome of Constantinople. The message was clear: oppose the emperor, and you will not merely lose. You will be destroyed. With his throne secure, Constantine convened the Council of Hieria in 754, a stage-managed gathering of bishops who declared, with full imperial backing, that icons were heretical. It was more than a religious decree. It was the legal green light for the persecution to come. What followed was destruction on a scale Byzantium had never seen. Centuries-old mosaics were hacked apart, churches stripped bare, icon painters silenced, their art erased. Even illustrated manuscripts were confiscated and burned. The empire's sacred beauty, gone in a storm of imperial fury. And Constantine's wrath had not yet reached its most dangerous target. In the monasteries of Byzantium, men and women still clung to their icons in defiance of the emperor. To him, they were not holy. They were parasites, enemies of the state. He was about to make them an example. By the mid-8th century, Constantine had declared total war on icon veneration, but the monasteries were still holding out. These cloistered communities, scattered across the empire, were more than places of prayer. They were fortresses of tradition, treasuries of wealth, and, in the emperor's eyes, nests of rebellion. Constantine saw them as parasites, exempt from taxes, free from military service, living off the empire's resources while openly defying his decrees. He believed that to kill icon worship, he had to kill monasticism itself. His first blow was economic. Monasteries that had stood for centuries found their lands seized overnight. Their fields were handed to soldiers, their treasures melted down for the state's coffers. The emperor claimed these measures were to fund the defense of the empire, but everyone knew the truth. This was about breaking their spine. When confiscation wasn't enough, he turned to humiliation. One of Constantine's most infamous acts took place in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, the same arena where chariots once raced and rebels had been blinded. There, before a jeering crowd, monks and nuns were dragged in, stripped of their robes, and forced to marry each other in public. These were not unions of love. They were acts of desecration, designed to shatter vows and turn holy men and women into spectacles of mockery. But humiliation was only the beginning. The emperor's general, Michael the Candraken, became a dark legend in his own right, a man who carried out the emperor's policies with zeal that bordered on sadism. Monks were threatened with blinding, beaten until they could no longer stand, or exiled to remote, barren lands. Some were locked in cells and left to starve. And then there was the fire. According to hostile chroniclers, Constantine himself sometimes oversaw the torture of monks. The most infamous account describes him smearing oil into the beards of condemned monastics and setting them alight, watching as the flames consumed their faces. Whether exaggerated or not, such stories burned themselves into memory of Byzantium. The most famous victim was Stephen the Younger, an abbot who became the voice of resistance. He defied the emperor openly, declaring that to destroy icons was to destroy the faith itself. His arrest was inevitable. The torture he endured was designed to break him, but Stephen never yielded. His refusal to submit turned him into a martyr, and martyrs, Constantine would soon learn, were far more dangerous than living opponents. Every monk who died for their icons became a banner for the underground resistance. Every nun who was beaten or exiled became a living indictment of the emperor's cruelty. Far from eradicating icon veneration, Constantine's campaign was forging a movement of defiance that no amount of blood could extinguish. The emperor had won battles, but he was starting to lose the war of belief. And deep in the shadows of his own capital, the resistance was learning how to survive. The emperor's war on icons had driven the faithful underground. The churches were bare now, walls stripped of mosaics, altars empty, the painted saints scraped away. But the devotion had not died. It had simply gone into hiding. In the darkened homes of Constantinople, small gatherings took place by candlelight. Wealthy families built false walls to conceal treasured icons. Beneath floorboards and behind tapestries, faces of Christ and the Virgin Mary waited in silence, hidden from imperial eyes. Outside the capital, the countryside became a labyrinth of safe houses and secret shrines. Remote mountain monasteries and cave churches became sanctuaries for images smuggled out of cities. In some cases, icons were spirited away entirely, carried across the sea to southern Italy or into Christian enclaves in Arab lands where Constantine's laws held no sway. The underground movement was organized, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. There were coded signals, the flicker of a lantern in a certain window, a scrap of cloth tied to a doorway, to identify safe contacts. Workshops hidden in cellars continued to paint and carve icons, knowing discovery meant torture or death. And among the quietest, most determined of all were the women, empresses and noble women, widows and mothers. They risked everything to preserve the old faith. They had miniature icons inside their sleeves, whispered forbidden prayers to their children, and smuggled food and coins to monks forced into exile. Their resistance was not loud, but it was unbreakable. This defiance gnawed at Constantine. He had stripped the churches, burned the icons, humiliated the monks, and still the images persisted. Still, the faith lived on in shadows. His paranoia deepened. Spies became his weapon of choice. Informants slipped into monasteries pretending to be pilgrims. Servants whispered to imperial agents about the prayers their masters muttered at night. A neighbor's suspicion could mean a midnight arrest. The city itself became a snare, where any step could lead to betrayal. Yet even under such pressure, the underground kept its links to the outside world. Letters from exiled monks in Italy slipped into the empire through smuggling routes, offering encouragement and theology to keep the faithful steadfast. The words compared their trials to those of the earliest Christians under Rome, framing Constantine as a new Nero, a persecutor whose time was running out. In the streets and markets, rumors began to spread, murmurs that God would punish the emperor, that no man could raise his hand against the saints and live. And though these whispers could get a person killed, they traveled faster than the emperor's soldiers could silence them. Constantine's empire was still outwardly strong, his armies victorious, his rule unchallenged. But beneath the surface, the cracks were spreading. The faithful were patient. They could wait, for sooner or later, they believed God's hand would fall. And when it did, they vowed it would be terrible. By the mid-8th century, the war between iconoclast and iconodule had moved beyond smashed mosaics and public humiliations. It had become a war of words, and the battlefield was history itself. Constantine's enemies were already writing his epitaph while he still sat on the throne. The most influential of these voices was Theophanes the Confessor, a monk who had lived through the emperor's reign, seen the prisons filled with tortured believers, and watched monasteries crumble into silence. In his chronicle, Theophanes painted Constantine not as a misguided ruler, but as something far darker, a monster, a beast, a ruler with a thirst for blood and an appetite for cruelty. In his pages, Constantine was no longer merely the enemy of the church. He was an agent of hell itself. Theophanes described him as a magician who consorted with demons, a forerunner to the Antichrist. His actions were framed not as political policies, but as attacks on the very foundation of God's order. And the accusations went beyond the destruction of images. Iconodule writers claimed Constantine had stripped Christianity of its heart, rejecting the intercession of saints, scorning the Virgin Mary, and even questioning the incarnation of Christ. Whether these charges were truth or propaganda mattered little. What mattered was that they stuck. Soon, the underground faithful were telling stories, not just of persecution, but of miracles that defied the emperor's will, icons that bled when struck, soldiers struck blind for destroying a saint's image, monks who survived execution attempts through divine intervention. These tales passed from mouth to mouth, growing in detail with every telling. Even Constantine's own family was not safe from suspicion. His daughter-in-law, Irene, was whispered to be secretly loyal to the icons. If true, it meant that God's truth had already crept into the heart of the imperial palace itself. As the years passed, the narrative was set. Constantine was no longer a man to his enemies. He was a symbol, the destroyer of God's images, the persecutor of the saints, and most importantly, a man who would face divine retribution. When earthquakes struck or armies faltered or sickness crept into the palace, the whispers always returned. This is the beginning. The faithful waited for the moment when their enemy would be struck down, not by sword or spear, but by the hand of God. In 773, the first cracks began to show in Constantine's invincible armor. At first, it was nothing alarming. A fever that lingered, a weakness in his limbs, small sores that refused to close. His court physicians assured him these were passing ailments. But the sores spread. They broke open into raw wounds that oozed and refused to heal. Byzantine medicine threw everything it had at him. Herbs, bloodletting, imported remedies from distant lands. Nothing worked. The sores became ulcers. The ulcers turned foul, their stench filling the corridors of the palace, no matter how much incense was burned. It wasn't just his body that changed. The man who had been decisive and controlled began issuing contradictory orders. He lashed out in sudden, violent rages, then sank into confusion. His advisors whispered behind closed doors. Was this illness or madness? To the iconodules, there was no question. This was God's judgment, manifesting exactly as the monks had foretold. The man who had burned icons was now rotting from the inside out. But Constantine refused to believe in divine punishment, at least at first. The longer the sickness dragged on, the more his certainty faltered. In secret, he began consulting not only physicians, but holy men, the same kind of people he had once imprisoned. He asked them about curses, about spirits, about whether an emperor could be struck by God. The disease gave no mercy. By 774, the ulcers had multiplied, spreading across his body. The account of Theophanes and other hostile chroniclers, exaggerated though they may have been, speak of worms and maggots breeding in his flesh. They claim his eyes, The very eyes that had looked upon holy images with contempt became infested with living parasites. Whether true or not, the story spread like wildfire. In the streets of Constantinople, people whispered of the emperor's punishment. In the monasteries, the monks prayed, not for his recovery, but for his suffering continue until full weight of God's wrath was spent. Yet even as his body betrayed him, Constantine clung to his throne. He still signed orders. He still sent soldiers to hunt down icon venerators. If anything, the disease seemed to sharpen his cruelty. From his sickbed, he commanded new tortures, new arrests. The faithful began to believe something remarkable, that the more he persecuted them, the more his body decayed. And if that was true, then the worst was yet to come. By the spring of 775, Constantine was more corpse than man. His body was wrapped in cloths to contain the stench. His eyes, clouded, swollen, and barely functional, leaked pus. Worms were said to writhe beneath the skin. The once commanding voice that had bellowed orders across battlefields now rasped and cracked. And yet he would not die quietly. Against the desperate pleas of his physicians, Constantine announced he would personally lead one final military campaign against the Bulgarians. His enemies were stirring at the empire's borders, and he would not allow his sickness or God to rob him of the chance to prove his strength. It was madness. His advisors knew it. The army knew it. But who could tell an emperor no? So the empire mobilized. Soldiers gathered. Supplies were stockpiled. And amid the clang of preparation, an unspoken truth hung in the air. This was not a campaign, but a funeral procession. When he arrived at the military camp, carried on a litter, the sight shocked even hardened veterans. The scourge of the monks was no longer the towering figure who had led them to victory. His skin was pale and sunken, his face wrapped in linen, his hands trembling. But still he gave orders. Still he demanded obedience. It was theater now, a grotesque performance of imperial strength. He placed himself in a tent near the front, pretending to direct strategy, though it was clear to all he could barely lift a hand. And even here, in the shadow of death, he pursued his vendetta. Orders went out to arrest and torture suspected icon venerators. Some soldiers, shaken by his condition, obeyed reluctantly. Others whispered that he was damning himself further with every act. The final days came quickly. His body failed in waves, fever, convulsions, delirium. Chroniclers claimed he raved about saints haunting him, their painted eyes following him into the darkness. Whether hallucination or conscience, it kept him thrashing in his bed until the end. On September 14th, 775, Constantine breathed his last in that military tent. No palace, no gold, no procession. Just the smell of rot, the groan of campfires, and the muffled murmurs of soldiers wondering if their emperor had been struck down by the hand of God. His death was a relief to some, a terror to others, and a gift to his enemies. Within days, stories of divine retribution spread through the empire. Monks told of justice fulfilled. Theophanes and other chroniclers etched every gory detail into history. The man who had once ruled unchallenged now became a cautionary tale, a warning to every ruler who thought himself greater than the God he served. The news reached Constantinople within days. The emperor was dead, not in triumph, but in filth and agony, far from the marble halls of the palace. Official proclamations praised his military genius and administrative skill. But in the streets, in the markets, and in the cloisters of hidden monasteries, no one spoke of his victories. They spoke only of the worms. To the iconodules, the persecuted faithful, it was the clearest proof imaginable that God himself had passed sentence. The man who had blinded monks, burned icons, and forced holy men into sham marriages had died blind, rotting, and humiliated. It was justice too perfect to be coincidence. Writers seized on the symbolism. Theophanes, a confessor, described the disease with morbid precision. The swelling, the ulcers, the infestation of the eyes. He wanted his readers to taste the punishment, to see it, to smell it. In his telling, Constantine's final agony became a holy warning. This is what awaits the enemies of God. Rumors flourished like wildfire. Some claimed saints had appeared at his bedside to condemn him. Others whispered that icons hidden in the empire wept tears of blood the day he died. A few swore that the emperor's corpse decayed unnaturally fast, as though the worms had been waiting for their feast. The propaganda was devastating. Even among Constantine's old allies in the army, there was unease. Men who had followed him through decades of war now wondered whether his iconoclastic crusade had indeed brought a curse upon the empire. His son, Leo IV, inherited the throne, and with it, a kingdom split between fear and faith. Outwardly, he maintained his father's policies. Inwardly, he tempered the persecution. The sight of the God-cursed emperor's death hung over him like a shadow. Abroad, the story spread across borders. In Rome, papal scribes recorded his death as divine vengeance, using it to condemn Byzantine iconoclasm. In the courts of the Franks, chroniclers nodded in grim satisfaction. Even in the Islamic world, where veneration of images was rejected, some saw his fate as proof that arrogance before God, any God, ended the same way. Within a year, Constantine's image as a mighty general was buried under the weight of legend. The details of his reign faded, but the story of his death only grew sharper, more grotesque, more moralistic. And so, the man who had sought to destroy sacred images became one himself, a living picture of imperial hubris punished by heaven. In the months following Constantine's death, the empire became a stage for his enemy's triumph. The iconodules, long hunted like criminals, emerged in the shadows to whisper his story as a sacred warning. They told it in the marketplaces, in the taverns, in the quiet corners of monasteries, always with the same refrain. The man who hated holy eyes lost his own to the worms. The tale evolved with each retelling. Chroniclers woven into scripture-like narratives, pairing his fate with biblical tyrants struck down by God's wrath. They described not just the physical horror, the rotting flesh, the maggot-filled sockets, but the spiritual symbolism, as if heaven had painted a final icon in his death, one more enduring than any he had destroyed. His story became a political weapon. Those opposing iconoclasm held his memory like a dagger against his successors. The mere mention of the worm-eaten emperor was enough to chill the courts of future rulers, a reminder that earthly power was nothing before divine judgment. Beyond Byzantine borders, his legend spread like smoke. In Rome, his death was retold from the pulpits as proof that the East had strayed from the true faith. In the courts of Charlemagne, it was used to justify resistance to Byzantine influence. Even Muslim chroniclers, while rejecting icons themselves, noted the irony of a ruler so zealous against images meeting an end so soaked in superstition. Years turned to decades. The facts of his reign, the battles won, the laws passed, the territories defended, faded into the dust of history. But the death remained. It was retold by candlelight in monasteries, painted in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, carved into the memory of the faithful. Constantine was no longer a man, nor even an emperor. He had become a parable, a grotesque saint of the damned, a reminder that no throne, no army, no glory could protect a man from the vengeance of heaven. And so, Constantine V, the terror of monks, the scourge of icons, was immortalized not in marble or gold, but in the whispered phrase that would follow him for all time. The emperor whose eyes the worms devoured,